And there was controversy. There were two separate autopsies that gave completely different answers. Someone was claiming it was very clearly beaten to death, from the descriptions I've read, it seems like it very definitely was. And then this SPCA inspector showed up and said, no, it died of natural causes, which I can't understand why.
Ta'alo Falava. I'm Gabi Lardies, staff writer at The Spin-Off, filling in for Mad Chapman. Welcome to Behind the Story, where we get behind the scenes of a big article on the spin-off from the week. Today, I'm talking to our Wellington editor, Joel MacManus, about a murder mystery that's over 100 years old. We published the yarn, The Unsolved Case of the Wellington Emu Murder, on Monday. It's a colourful story with tons of detail about the emu that was kept in a paddock with a tin shed at the Wellington Botanic Gardens before being transferred to the zoo in 1907, where it died 10 days later. I wanted to ask Joel why he wrote about something 118 years after the fact and where he got his information from, since everyone involved, including the emu, are surely dead by now. Here's Joel MacManus on Behind the Story. Good morning, Joel. Thank you for joining us today.
Kia ora, Gabby. How are you?
Oh, I'm bloody good. Got a little scratch in my throat, and I think it's going to make me sound even better than ever.
Oh, you sound great.
So we're here to talk about a juicy yarn that we published on the site on Monday about the suspected murder of an emu in Wellington Zoo 118 years ago. It's not usual that an online magazine would publish a story from last century, but I can't help but notice it's quite a Joel style of story. Like just last year, you also reopened the question and wrote what was actually a behemoth investigation into whether or not Te Rauparaha had a drink, and a free drink at that, at the Thistle Inn. I don't think anyone else has kind of dug into these classic Wellington legends with quite the same vigor that you have. What made you want to investigate them?
Yeah, we're nothing if not topical, right? I think that history just has so much, so many amazing yarns that are just basically untapped, right? Sometimes it's really relevant to what's happening today. Sometimes it's just an interesting story that you can get to the bottom of. And kind of the thing that, made me really interested in them is just, it's kind of a game changer how it's possible to do this research now through Papers Past, which is just an incredible resource. The National Library, since about 2000, has been gradually digitizing, dozens of old newspapers around the country, and it means that, it means you can search for things. The Te Rauparaha story, for example, 20 years ago, if I wanted to do that, I would have had to go to the National Library archives and pore through, pages and pages of papers, and I wouldn't have known what I was looking for. Same with the emu story, actually. It would have just taken, a lot of just groundwork and sitting in a library, opening up every single newspaper, hoping to find something. And through this, it means you can actually search for keywords. It's not perfect, but if you put the work in, you can find some pretty incredible stories. And it really is just, it's this gold mine that's sitting there that people haven't looked at, really, because, why would you? Unless you're me and you just get really obsessed with some very obscure corner of history. But it really is quite a, there's an opportunity there to find out all sorts of fascinating things.
Can you tell me more about how you navigate Papers Past and your sort of research process? because you kind of just said like, oh, of course you can get to the bottom of these questions. And I would have never thought that I could get to the bottom of these over 100-year-old questions.
Yeah, well, I think in both cases, the Te Rauparaha story and the emu story, I've done other stories using papers past as well. Back when I was at Stuff a few years ago, I did a story about the mayor of Wellington in something like 1906 just ran away and vanished, and no one ever figured out where he went. And I managed to find a note in papers past from about 15 years after the fact from someone who was just like, I was in New Orleans and I ran into this guy who used to be the mayor of Wellington.
Wow.
But I think in both cases, like you've got to know what you're looking for, right? So you need like a question that you're asking and you're trying to get to the bottom of, and then you can constrain your search by region or by particular newspaper, and then you can also put year boundaries around it, because if you just punch in emu, you're going to find, an enormous amount. But I knew that it happened in 1907, so I was kind of constraining my search, first just to 1907 and just to newspapers in Wellington. Then, I looked a bit nationwide because some other newspapers picked up the story, and then, I looked a little bit wider, looked a couple years either side to find like a bit more context about the zoo. But then I was just searching like basic keywords: Wellington Zoo, emu, Newtown emu, things like that, and just, sometimes because it's digitized, sometimes the papers past like can't exactly work out what word is, like zoo often got mistaken for 200, things like that. But for the most part, you can get a bit of a the search works quite well, and if you kind of line your dates up, you can get quite a good record.
And in the Te Rauparaha Thistle Inn story, you also had historical photographs and paintings. Were they also in papers past?
Not in papers past, but I was, looking at every historical, source I can find. Like I actually, that story, I didn't leave that was entirely internet research. I could have gone to Papa or the National Library to get more, but basically, I managed to find pictures through, archive websites and things like that. Te Rauparaha is a very important historical figure in New Zealand, so there are, records of him, and I was cross-checking everything against his Wikipedia page and, a podcast about him. And, I actually scanned through a biography of him that was written by his son, because he briefly mentioned a trip to Wellington in that book. And then again, it was just lining up the dates, because I managed to identify, like from papers past, there were 2 instances where he visited Wellington post-British settlers arriving, which were the only possible times that he could have gone to the Thistle Inn. And so that gave me some like date marks to work on. And then it was like a process of, can I work out where he stayed at that trip? And in one instance, it did mention where he stayed, and it was a place quite nearby. The other, it didn't say where he stayed, but it did say he was visiting someone who again lived quite nearby. So I went, okay, well, we can place him in the general area, at a time when the Thistle Inn existed. And so it really is just a bit of detective work.
Yeah, I'm sitting here being like, what a sleuth.
I mean, I got really obsessed with that story, even to the point that, like I was like trying to figure out, like it was like, oh, he went to visit this particular missionary, and I was like, okay, where did that missionary live? And then I started looking into that missionary, and I found an address, and then was trying to see if I can find paintings or photos so I could like figure out where that was in relation to the Thistle Inn. But it was really just like, you start with a question and then you chase every little clue until you can piece it together.
Yeah, I was just amazed when you deducted where this missionary lived from a painting that you found. Because of the shape of the hill, and therefore it's probably around this street. I was like, mind blown.
Well, for what it's worth, I walk down that street every day on my commute to work, so I did recognise the area.
Yeah, there's that local knowledge too, right? That gives you these questions to ask because they're kind of like urban legends in the area, right? And then give you like clues for your clues to kind of put them together. Although the emu murder mystery, that's not so well known in Wellington, is it?
No, in that case wasn't an
you?
urban legend. I actually just stumbled across that while researching for a different story. I was reading the Wikipedia page for the Botanic Gardens, and it just had a line saying, animals used to be kept in the Botanic Gardens, including an emu, until it was transferred to the zoo where it died soon afterwards. And then I looked through to the source on that, which linked to a Papers Past article. And then when I read that, it said actually the emu was killed and appeared to have been beaten to death. And that just immediately went, okay, well, that's fascinating. I've got to get to the bottom of this. And then, I just started searching more and more and more on Papers Past, and found, more details. It was very widely reported because this was a big news story at the time. And I think then, as today, people were quite fascinated by it. And there was controversy. There were two separate autopsies that gave completely different answers. Someone was claiming it was very clearly beaten to death, from the descriptions I've read, it seems like it very definitely was. And then this SPCA inspector showed up and said, no, it died of natural causes, which I can't understand why.
Yeah, because there's this other element of your story, which is also a bit of a media analysis, because you look at how the story kind of spread and what different outlets said. Do you ever imagine a future Joel doing that to the media today? And what would that story be that future Joel would want to get to the bottom of?
Well, that's a tough question.
Maybe too tough.
I suppose I think the thing that makes these stories about the past interesting is that the information is there. We just don't know it. It's not easily Googleable, but you can figure it out if you put enough work in. And it's the fact that it's pre-internet stuff that makes it more difficult and therefore more interesting to find, and it's kind of fallen out of the collective memory. So no one knows, even though it is, again, an answerable question.
Yeah, I think people also don't know it's an answerable question. Like you were saying, all the Papers Past is fairly recent and always kind of being added to. I didn't know there was so much on there. And I've always thought of it as this kind of janky, hard-to-use website. But it's not the case anymore, eh? It's all Flash and...
I don't find it. I don't find it too bad, and I think there's an element of once you get obsessed enough with a mystery, which I'm definitely someone who, when I start a story, I tend to get pretty obsessed. You want it. I just keep going back to it. I'll come home from work and I'm I can't stop thinking about it, and I'll just spend a couple more hours on Papers Past. But yeah, it's actually not a particularly hard website to use. You can filter by relevance or by date. Filtering by order of date is useful because you can, again, get the timeline right. It's actually something that New Zealand is incredibly lucky to have. A lot of countries don't have a resource like this, and there are so many fascinating stories in our history that are just kind of sitting there waiting to be unraveled.
How do you pitch these kind of historical stories to, say, the editors? How do you, I guess because they always ask why now, why is this relevant now? How do you convince them that the audience, that this is a juicy yarn, and B, people are interested in this 100-year-old emu murder mystery, which, by the way, I very much was.
To an extent, I just start working on it because... you need to know if there's a story there before discussing it with anyone. So, on the emu, in fact, on both stories, I was digging around them for a while just to be like, oh, can I get any traction here before I actually mentioned it to either of our editors. I am fortunate, I guess, that with my windbag column, I have a little bit more, I guess, freedom as long as it's Wellington related to look into different things. But, in both cases, I talk to our editors and I think, windbag is often a opinion-heavy column about local government issues in Wellington, but I'm quite keen to broaden it out and just make it, all sorts of interesting yarns about Wellington, that things that fascinate me, and I hope that if they fascinate me, they'll also fascinate the reader.
Yeah, seems to be working so far. I was also wondering if you've had any history buffs kind of refute any of your methodologies or findings, because history is often quite a contested thing. And someone might say, oh, but I read this other thing that said this.
Not on either of these stories. In fact, I actually had a quite respected historian reach out to me after the Te Rauparaha story and say, they initially saw the headline and thought, oh God, some journalists tried to be a historian, but then they said they were quite impressed and they thought my conclusion seemed accurate. So that was nice to know.
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, you're so rigorous in your investigations. I can't see how anyone could kind of fault it. And I really like how you, your process is evident in the article as well. So it's not that you're suddenly saying this happened and then this happened. You're saying, I found this here and this is what this primary source said. So I really like how, I don't know, you kind of open the layers of how you do things within the article.
Yeah, I found that quite important actually because, well, like I just said, I'm not a trained historian, I'm not an academic. So rather than just telling people the things I want to just lay out everything that I've found and just say, okay, I'm trying to answer this question, so here's what I figured out, and that raises this question, here's what I've found, and kind of, it's everyone's going to be able to draw their own conclusions, but I'm just kind of laying out the evidence and framing it in a mystery where it is question after question, which is just quite a compelling narrative. Like I like writing stories with a mystery framing. And then, yeah, I think I do have that sense of imposter syndrome, especially with the Te Rauparaha story, because he's a figure who is, has an immense amount of mana, but he's also very controversial. And I was really didn't want to make judgments, or definitely didn't want to draw any wrong conclusions. So I did see it as just lay out the facts as they are, as I can figure them out, and then, even at the end of the story, when I kind of conclude, I think it's almost certain that he went, but I can't say it 100%, but he was in the right area at the right time, and it turns out he was friends with the owner for at least a decade. So I think it's very likely he went in, but I can't say for sure.
Yeah. What incredible findings. And I love how you really pull the reader along with your questions, because it's just great.
Thank you.
I love how you kind of have a question, do the investigation, and then at the end of each part there's another question, so you go, oh my god, yeah, what next?
There's always more questions. You think you find a bit of evidence and then you go, actually that just raises more questions.
So to kind of conclude our chat, is there a historical mystery that you're currently looking into or looking to get your little claws into?
There is, but it's not one that I as far as I can tell, it's not one that I think I can answer with papers past. And I'm still trying to figure it out. But what I want to find out is, I want to figure out where the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in Wellington. because, the Tidity was, sent across the country for signings, and we know that it was signed in Wellington in late April 1840, and there's a record of this happening, and I think it happened on a ship, like, so it possibly never went on land, but I've not been able to figure out where that was, and I've only been able to find very vague references to it. So that's something I'd love to get to the bottom of. It may have to come down to like missionary notes or something like that. There's a few sources from early settlers who wrote books about their time, and Tidity was actually quite controversial among the British settlers in Wellington because the New Zealand Company, which had founded the city, kind of initially wanted to do things their own way. So the British Crown showing up and saying we're in charge was actually kind of annoying for them.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that'd be quite nice. And again, if I can figure out if it did happen on land, or at least like if the ship was like by a wharf, it'd just be nice to have a site to be like, this is where that happened here.
Yeah. Wow, I can't wait till you try to find that and hopefully come up with a possible location. We could make a plaque for it and everything.
Yeah, well, now that I've said it on this podcast, I think I'm going to have to do it.
Yeah. Commissioned.
Okay, boss.
Well, thanks so much for chatting to me this morning, Joel. It's been really fun, and you've inspired me to go sniff around Papers Past.
Oh, I'm sure you're going to find some fun stuff. Thanks so much, Gabi.
Thank you, Joel. That was Joel MacManus on Behind the Story. I'll be back next week with another spin-off writer and another spin-off yarn. Thanks for listening.